I'm a mastering engineer. I get to spend every day making somebody else's music sound great. Mastering is the final part of the creative process in making a record. An artist records, mixes, and then masters. It's also the least understood part of the process. In fact, when I was in high school, I had no idea what a mastering engineer was. I'd seen mastering engineers credited on a lot of my favorite records, and I had this vague sense, this idea that maybe it was part of the creative process, but I really didn't know. What I did know was that I wanted to have a career in music. In fact, I wanted to be a rock star. Because if I was going to have a career in music, what else was there? From a very young age, I loved music. This was my best friend, the Sony Walkman. For those of you that haven't seen one, this is a personal music device that plays music on cassette tapes. It was like the iPod of its day. And I brought mine everywhere I went. I also watched way too much MTV. And not the reality TV, MTV of today, but the original music television. I was a music fanatic. My love of music grew and expanded to the point where in my early teenage years, I knew I wanted to play an instrument. And I loved rock and roll. I knew I didn't want to play piano, I didn't want to play in my school band, and I didn't want to sing. In fact, I'll just admit to you today, I can't sing. I also knew I didn't want to play electric guitar, which was the instrument that most young aspiring rockers like myself gravitated towards. What I wanted to play was bass guitar. I wanted to hold down the rhythm section and be unassuming and out of the spotlight. So with the help of friends and fellow musicians, I started to learn how to play the bass guitar and joined many rock bands. As I got really serious about my playing, I started to realize that if I wanted to be the best musician I could be, I was going to have to dive a little deeper than just playing my bass in a band. So I started taking lessons, I studied music theory, I did eventually join the school band, the jazz band, and I even joined my high school choir. To this day, I still can't sing. But I was learning all of these aspects of music that previously I had no idea existed. I started to think about my musicianship in broader terms. So my senior year of high school rolled around, and I had to make a decision about what I was going to do. What I wanted to do, what I really, really wanted to do, was to see one of my bands get signed, go on to make records, go tour the world, and not even bother going to school. Because that's how it happens, isn't it? You get discovered, you get signed, you end up being famous and on MTV. Well, needless to say, that's not really how it happens. So how did I go from being this young guy with rock and roll aspirations and long hair to being this slightly older guy just thrilled to be holding his first Grammy Award? Well, my band didn't get signed. But what did happen to me that year was I had my first experience in the recording studio. I didn't know very much about the studio. I didn't know very much about the technology. But I really loved the experience. We spent countless hours getting great sounds and playing over and over again to get the best takes possible. This really spoke to me. So I decided I knew I wanted this career in music and that I'd go to school for music, but I wanted to keep my options open a little bit. My mom and dad kept telling me about having a backup plan. So I decided I'd go to school for music performance with an emphasis in sound recording technology. That wasn't exactly the backup plan that they intended, but it was one that worked for me. So that experience in the recording studio had really piqued my interest. Prior to that, I just hadn't realized that there were professionals that made a living recording other people's music. I also hadn't realized that somebody outside of the band itself or the recording artists themselves could have such a hand in shaping somebody else's sound. So I went off to college, I started studying recording, and my focus began to shift dramatically. All I wanted to do was be in the recording studio. And I no longer wanted to be there as the performer or the musician being recorded, but I wanted to be the guy recording the musicians and making them sound great. I had decided at that point that the bass guitar was no longer going to be my principal instrument, but the recording studio was. I love spending time setting up microphones, getting sounds, playing with effects and devices in the control room, all to serve the musician's vision. I was on my path to becoming a recording engineer. So senior year of college rolled around, and I decided maybe I should start thinking about this path of being a recording engineer in broader terms. So I started to think of this wider definition of audio engineer. And I became the president of our Audio Engineering Society student chapter. The AES is this international organization dedicated to audio technology, audio professionals, and the audio industry. And as president of our AES chapter, my job was to invite industry professionals in to speak to our student body. I wanted to invite really accomplished and interesting speakers from a various range of disciplines in audio. This was really a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about other career paths and other parts of the audio industry that I just wasn't learning about in the classroom. I invited professionals from the television industry, from sports broadcasting, loudspeaker manufacturing, sound design, and so on and so forth. In fact, I had this really great experience with the sports broadcaster who had invited me to the Boston Garden to sit in his mobile audio truck and watch him mix a Boston Bruins game live to television. It was an experience like I had never had before. I had no idea that somebody made a living doing that kind of work. I had also invited a legendary mastering engineer who had just made the move from New York City to Portland, Maine. And he was gracious enough to make the trek down to Massachusetts to speak to our student chapter. And as I did with all of the professionals that I invited to speak, I spent a lot of time researching what it was that he did. What was mastering, and what was a mastering engineer? And what I found was amazing, at least to me. I found that a mastering engineer got to affect a recording as a whole. Now, as a recording engineer, I loved focusing on the small details, the minutia of the process of recording. How am I going to make the guitar sound this way or that way? How do I want the kick drum and the snare drum to sound? This was a really creative thing to do, and I enjoyed it a lot. But seeing that mastering engineers got to affect the recording globally just really spoke to me. It spoke to that young fan of music that spent countless hours listening and just loving music. I also began to realize that mastering was post-production and a more solitary part of the overall process. And that spoke to that unassuming, out of the spotlight bass player in me. So to this day, I work as a mastering engineer. In fact, I've spent a majority of my adult life working as a mastering engineer. And I do it at the studio owned by that legendary mastering engineer that I invited to come and speak for our AES student chapter. I had broadened my horizons quite a bit. I started out as a young fan of music. That led me to become a musician, which piqued my interest in recording and engineering, and ultimately got me to where I am today, a mastering engineer. So I went from my best friend, the Sony Walkman, that I carried around with me all the time and spent countless hours listening to music on, to spending most of my days in my studio at Gateway Mastering. And I got there by being curious and taking the time to learn everything about the music and recording industry that I could. So I invite you, whatever you're passionate about, whatever you love, whatever career path you're going down, I invite you to think of it in broader terms. Take the time to be curious, research, and learn as much about it as you possibly can. You might be surprised by the path it takes you down. I was very surprised by my own. Thank you.